I was standing in the packed town hall, coffee still warm in my hand, when my VP, Mark Dillard, looked straight at me and announced I was terminated. No warning, no private meeting, just humiliation in front of 200 colleagues. He claimed I'd falsified compliance records, as if 8 years of spotless work meant nothing. The room went silent. Some stared. Others avoided my eyes. But while he thought I'd crumble, he didn't know I'd been quietly documenting everything. His trap wasn't airtight. It was leaking. Before I go on, where are you watching from? Hit that like button and subscribe, because the next part of this story is where everything flips upside down. The morning had started like any other in the glass and steel tower, where our logistics division ran its endless calculations, compliance reports, and client renewals. I had my coffee balanced in one hand, my notebook in the other, already thinking about the quarterly audit we were finalizing. The department town hall was supposed to be routine: updates, metrics, polite applause for hitting another milestone. But the air shifted when Mark Dillard, our newly installed VP, stepped to the podium with that smug confidence he carried like armor. He was only 3 months into the role, yet he acted as if the entire building had been constructed for him. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on me, and then, with no preamble, he announced my name and declared my employment terminated, effective immediately, citing serious compliance failures. The words landed like a grenade in the crowded room. Conversation stopped mid-breath. 200 pairs of eyes turned to me as if waiting for me to collapse or defend myself. I stood frozen, coffee still warm against my palm, my pulse steady but heavy. Fired. Not in private. Not with a quiet meeting behind HR's closed doors. Fired in front of colleagues, managers, analysts, even the interns who barely knew my name. He spoke as though my 8 years of spotless compliance work meant nothing, as if the clients I had protected and the regulatory storms I had guided us through never happened. On the massive projector screen, he gestured to a slide showing evidence of my supposed failures: audit discrepancies, unsigned files, a pattern of negligence. Gasps rippled through the rows. I knew instantly what this was. He had buried my latest audit because it threatened a $400 million deal he was chasing. And now he was using this public spectacle to silence me permanently. The shame he expected never arrived. Instead, I felt an eerie calm, as if the ground beneath me had hardened into steel. I had been documenting everything for months, quietly building an archive of directives, memos, and access logs. Mark thought humiliation would break me, but I knew something he didn't. The truth leaves trails, and his were everywhere. Mark Dillard didn't just arrive at our company. He descended on it like a storm front. 3 months earlier, he had been installed as vice president after years of floating between flashy executive roles, always leaving behind glossy headlines and messy trails others had to clean up. He was tall, polished, and spoke in boardroom jargon that sounded convincing until you actually listened closely. People like him didn't build systems, they built empires of perception. And the higher the perception, the steeper the fall when reality arrived. He'd identified me quickly as a threat, though he never said it aloud. I was the compliance manager who had been here long before his tailored suit swept through the lobby. I didn't chase headlines or impress investors with buzzwords. My work lived in the footnotes, the details, the small corrections that prevented million-dollar disasters before they happened. I had no interest in his spotlight, but for someone like Mark, my existence was intolerable. People who did their jobs quietly reminded him of the gaps in his own foundation. The closer his $400 million contract loomed, the more hostile his gaze became. Then there was Erin Cross, his chosen protégé, the one he paraded through meetings like a prized asset. She was young, eager, and already echoing his phrases as if they were scripture. It was no coincidence that my firing opened a neat vacancy exactly where she stood waiting. She had shadowed me for weeks under the guise of learning processes, but I'd noticed the way she lingered near my files, the way she asked oddly specific questions about systems she didn't need to touch. Looking back, it was preparation, a way to map out where to insert the poison. Mark's motive was transparent if you knew where to look. My audit had uncovered irregularities in vendor invoices, red flags that suggested more than sloppy bookkeeping. If I had escalated them to the board, his contract would have collapsed before it left the runway. So he did the next best thing, erase the auditor instead of the errors. He wanted me gone, not just off the deal but out of the building, discredited beyond repair. And he wanted it public. Humiliation was his weapon, intimidation his strategy. He believed a compliance manager could be crushed under the weight of spectacle, erased in a single announcement. What he didn't understand was that unlike him, I didn't operate in shadows of perception. I had the truth, time-stamped and archived, and once truth is unearthed, it doesn't bow to titles or theatrics. After the town hall dissolved into awkward whispers and forced shuffling of papers, I was escorted into a side room by HR with a sealed packet in hand. They placed it on the table like a verdict already signed, their eyes sliding away from mine as though my presence carried contamination. The envelope was thick, heavier than it should have been, and when I opened it, the weight became clear. Inside was a termination letter citing falsified audit records, policy breaches, and negligence that supposedly endangered client trust. Attached were printed screenshots of audit logs with missing entries, unsigned compliance reports, and system notes that suggested my initials had been erased or replaced. I flipped through page after page, each more damning than the last, each crafted to paint me as reckless and untrustworthy. On the surface, it looked airtight, the kind of packet designed to withstand any denial. But I had been working in compliance too long not to notice the cracks. The so-called audit logs were altered, metadata cropped out, timestamps too uniform, signatures that looked scanned instead of generated. One document claimed to be an invoice review I had supposedly mishandled, except the vendor ID was from a client I had never been assigned to. Another page contained a compliance checklist with my digital sign-off missing, but I remembered completing it personally, and the original file had a board upload confirmation dated weeks earlier. Mark hadn't just accused me. He had built a full dossier of fabricated evidence, polished enough to intimidate anyone who didn't know the systems as intimately as I did. HR's representative, a woman named Patel, asked in a neutral tone if I had any immediate response. I kept my voice calm, steady, even though my insides burned. "This packet doesn't reflect reality," I said. "It reflects what someone wants reality to look like." She blinked but didn't respond, only made a note on her legal pad. That silence confirmed what I already suspected. This wasn't just an HR action. It was Mark's stage play, designed to sweep me out before I could counter his narrative. He wanted the rest of the company to believe I was a liability, to erase my credibility in one clean strike. By planting errors, forging my initials, and removing logs, he had constructed a trap that looked airtight. But what he underestimated was how carefully I documented everything. For months, I had been archiving records, saving directives directly from board channels, preserving IT access logs, and cataloging compliance memos that supported every decision I'd made. What he thought would bury me was in fact the shovel that pointed straight back to him. I closed the packet slowly and slid it back across the table. "I'll cooperate fully with this review," I told HR, my voice steady, my gaze locked. Inside, though, I was already planning my next move, because this wasn't the end of my career. It was the beginning of his collapse. When I walked back into the open office, I could feel the shift immediately. Conversations dulled, Glances darted, and even the people who used to greet me every morning suddenly looked through me as if I had already vanished from the company directory. That was exactly what Mark wanted. He thrived on isolation, the slow erosion of confidence that turned professionals into ghosts. But instead of panic, I felt a strange clarity. The packet they had handed me was polished. Yes, but I had already spotted the seams. Mark believed he had buried me under forged audit logs and altered compliance records, but he had forgotten who he was dealing with. I wasn't just another manager. I was the person who lived inside these systems, who knew the difference between a genuine timestamp and one manufactured for show. My strength had never been grand speeches or boardroom theatrics. It was meticulous, quiet, and relentless. Months earlier, when I first noticed subtle changes, files opening under my name after I had logged out, drafts edited in ways I didn't recognize, Erin Cross asking questions that were far too specific for her role, I started saving everything. Not to expose anyone, not at first, but because I had learned long ago that survival in compliance meant creating your own safety net. I had copies of directives signed by the board that aligned exactly with my decisions. I had IT access logs showing every login, every workstation, every discrepancy tied to Mark's authority. I had memos from clients thanking me for catching errors that the packet now claimed I had missed. And most importantly, I had preserved whistleblower protections that guaranteed my ability to escalate when systems were abused. That archive was my shield, invisible to everyone around me but strong enough to withstand the storm Mark thought he had unleashed. I sat at my desk, ignoring the whispers, and opened a plain folder on my laptop labeled Policy Notes. Inside were dozens of subfolders, each carefully dated, each containing the kind of evidence no fabricated packet could erase. While Mark basked in his false victory, planning to slot Erin neatly into my role, I was already building the foundation of his undoing. Quiet strength doesn't draw attention. It waits. It prepares. It sharpens. And in that moment, I knew that the humiliation he had staged was only temporary. The truth was patient, and I was its custodian. The following morning, I was summoned to a glass-walled conference room, the kind where the blinds were half closed to suggest confidentiality, while still letting everyone outside watch the spectacle. Waiting for me were two compliance officers, the HR representative Patel, and my department manager, whose expression carried more fatigue than authority. They slid the same termination packet across the table as though its weight alone could crush me. One officer, his voice deliberately neutral, asked me to walk them through the discrepancies. I nodded calmly, opening my notebook and laying out my records one by one. I began with the so-called audit errors, showing the original board directives I had preserved, each with digital confirmation and timestamps that aligned perfectly with my actions. I pointed out that the altered versions in the packet were missing metadata, an impossible omission in authentic system exports. Their pens paused, eyes narrowing. Next, I presented IT logs I had quietly archived, records that showed my account accessed at times I was badged out of the building. The logins came from a workstation tied directly to Mark Dillard's clearance. The taller officer leaned back in his chair, exchanging a look with his partner. Then I brought out client memos, emails from major accounts thanking me for correcting draft errors within minutes, errors that the packet now framed as negligence. The contrast was glaring. The HR representative's face tightened as she realized that what was supposed to be evidence against me had already started crumbling under its own contradictions. My department manager finally spoke, his voice low. "Do you have proof these logs are genuine?" I slid across printed screenshots and a portable drive with encrypted files. All original, untouched, pulled directly from system exports before Mark restricted my access. If you cross-reference with IT security, you'll find identical entries. There was silence for a long moment, the kind of silence where the air feels heavier than stone. The shorter officer finally cleared his throat. These anomalies, they don't implicate you. They suggest manipulation upstream. We all knew what that meant. The chain didn't end with me, it began above me. The meeting shifted after that. Questions that had been framed as accusations became clarifications. Instead of defending myself, I was demonstrating how someone else had engineered the illusion of misconduct. I could see the recalibration in their faces, the realization that they had been handed a narrative that didn't hold up under scrutiny. Mark had been confident enough to fire me in front of 200 people, certain no one would question the packet he assembled. But under the fluorescent lights of that conference room, his script began to unravel line by line. And as I packed up my notebook when the meeting ended, I knew the weight had shifted. The trap wasn't closing on me anymore. It was slowly snapping shut around him. 2 days after that tense review, the conference room blinds closed again. Only this time, it wasn't me being called in. Word spread across the floor like static. Mark Dillard had been summoned by compliance and HR. The entire office pretended not to notice, but every head tilted when he walked past, shoulders squared, jaw tight, Erin Cross trailing behind him with a folder clutched to her chest like it might shield her. For nearly an hour the door stayed shut. I kept my eyes on my screen, but I could feel the nervous current running through the building. When the door finally opened, Mark emerged without his usual swagger. His tie was loosened, his expression sharp with anger but undercut by something worse: fear. The officers didn't look at him as he stalked down the hall. Erin followed, her face pale, her earlier bravado drained. Minutes later, security appeared. Quiet, professional, unmistakable. They escorted Mark back to his office, waited as he handed over his badge and laptop, and then walked him out of the building. There was no speech, no protest, no dramatic outburst. Just the dull sound of footsteps and the closing of a career built on perception. Erin's promotion evaporated before it had a chance to materialize. She sat frozen at her desk, fingers hovering above her keyboard, eyes red as though she had just realized her mentor had used her as a pawn in his game. No one cheered, no one clapped. That isn't how corporate life works. Instead, people stared harder at their screens, typing as though the rhythm could cover the fact that they were watching a man unravel in real time. For me, it wasn't triumph in the cinematic sense. It was quiet vindication, the kind that seeps into your bones and steadies your hands. The very systems Mark had tried to weaponize against me, logs, metadata, signatures, had turned on him. His downfall didn't come from rumor or spectacle, but from the evidence he thought he had mastered. As he disappeared through the glass doors, I understood something clearly. Collapse doesn't always arrive with an explosion. Sometimes it's just a quiet escort out of a building, leaving behind an empty office and a silence that speaks louder than any accusation. The week after Mark was escorted out, the company felt different. His name vanished from the org chart, his office door stayed locked, and the endless chatter about his bold strategies went silent. HR issued a formal statement confirming his termination for cause and announced Erin's removal from any succession plans. My inbox, once flooded with clipped responses and suspicious silences, filled again with genuine messages from colleagues relieved to have the truth out. Patel from HR called me in, thanked me for my cooperation, and offered me reinstatement with back pay, even a title bump. It was meant to be an apology, a recognition that I had endured humiliation for a crime I hadn't committed. But as I sat in her office, staring at the polished offer letter, I realized something important. I no longer wanted to belong to a company that allowed spectacle to replace integrity. Being publicly fired wasn't just a personal betrayal, it was a sign of how fragile trust had become here. I thanked her, declined politely, and walked out with my head high. A week later, I accepted a role at a rival firm that had watched the ordeal closely and valued the one thing Mark never understood: my record of consistent, documented integrity. They gave me a team, a voice, and something I hadn't felt in months: respect. The moral wasn't complicated. Getting fired hadn't ended me. It had exposed him. Documentation was my survival, and patience was my weapon. Revenge didn't arrive with shouting or applause. It came in the quiet realization that truth, once revealed, writes its own ending. And as I passed the empty office Mark once occupied, I carried the lesson with me. Collapse always comes for those who build their power on lies. When I look back on what happened, the most powerful lesson isn't about revenge or even vindication. It's about preparation. Mark tried to erase my career in a single announcement, but the truth was bigger than his theatrics. What saved me wasn't luck. It was the quiet discipline of documenting, archiving, and refusing to let convenience replace integrity. In a world where perception often drowns reality, the details we preserve can become lifelines. Getting fired in front of 200 people could have destroyed my confidence. Instead, it forced me to lean on the evidence I had built day by day, proof that my work meant more than his accusations. That's the part I want people to carry forward. Documentation is survival, not just in compliance, but in everyday life. Keep records of your commitments, your wins, your conversations. Not because you expect betrayal, but because transparency protects you when the storm comes. Another lesson is that revenge doesn't need to be loud. Watching Mark escorted out wasn't a cinematic triumph. It was a quiet confirmation that the same system he tried to twist eventually turned on him. Justice in real life rarely looks like a standing ovation. It looks like truth surfacing, lies collapsing, and the chance to walk away with your dignity intact. For anyone navigating toxic workplaces, remember this: you can't control other people's ambition or deceit, but you can control how prepared you are when the moment of testing arrives. How to get started today. Save important emails and project records in a private, organized archive. Write down dates, times, and key decisions in a simple notebook. Reflect weekly on your progress, and keep small notes of what you've achieved. Build trust with colleagues by consistently delivering on your promises. Your reputation becomes its own defense. Revenge doesn't always mean destruction. Sometimes it simply means holding on long enough for dishonesty to expose itself. Before I end this story, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment, share this with someone who's been through workplace drama, and don't forget to subscribe, because the next story will take you even deeper.